Welcome back to the School of Muscle podcast. Today I have on Dr. Leigh Breen, and we're going to discuss one of the studies that he was involved with. And this study was titled Short Interset Rest Blunts Resistance Exercise-Induced Increases in Myofibrillar Protein Synthesis and Intracellular Signaling in Young Males. And we're also going to discuss maybe if there's been any other literature since the publication of this study in 2016, since then as well, that has kind of changed his mind about any of the findings here, but that's going to be kind of the main topic of our discussion today. So I think a good place for us to start here, Dr. Breen, is what is maybe some background on what kind of led you to wanting to do this study in the first place?
Yeah, sure thing, Ryan. So we had a big interest in understanding the drivers of muscle protein synthesis and muscle hypertrophy in response to resistance exercise. And over the previous maybe 2 to 3 decades before this study, there had been a kind of growing movement towards manipulating resistance training variables to optimize hypertrophy and growth around the concept of maximizing hormonal changes in response to a given variable. So, for example, people had looked at things like the amount of muscle that you exercise in a given session, so a large amount of muscle mass, perhaps also the load that you lift with as well, and how these variables can manipulate the hormonal response, so how much testosterone and growth hormone you secrete. And there was an idea or a concept that response, that hormonal rise, somehow drives protein synthesis and cellular growth in the long term. So some great work coming out of Professor Stuart Phillips' lab at McMaster University had kind of systematically dismantled this concept over a number of years previously. So they'd shown a dissociation between these hormonal responses and how much you can switch on protein synthesis and cellular growth. But one variable that hadn't been explored was rest interval. So again, in most of the literature and certainly the textbooks and guidelines that really are out there for S&C coaches, there was an idea that keeping rest interval as brief as possible would elicit greater hormonal rises over the course of a workout, and in turn, that would support preferential gains in muscle mass over time. So we wanted to try and explore that idea in a little bit more detail, and we were fortunate enough to be in a position where we could use stable isotope tracers and muscle biopsies to explore this question in more detail.
Perfect. So there was kind of this idea that what you did in the gym could affect these kind of acute responses in hormones, anabolic hormones, and different things like that might lead to better or worse muscle growth. And one kind of area that wasn't explored was rest intervals. So you guys kind of sought out to kind of fill that kind of gap in the research.
Yeah, I mean, and there hadn't really been any mechanistic studies prior to our work. So there'd been a whole bunch of studies showing that by manipulating the amount of rest in between sets of resistance exercise, you can indeed alter concentrations of growth hormone and testosterone that are secreted. And there were also a number of studies in relatively small cohorts that had attempted to do this in the longer term with a training intervention. So train people for a number of weeks or months with 1 of 2 or 3 different rest intervals between sets. And again, the evidence there was kind of equivocal. Some showed superior effects of shorter intervals, some superior effects of longer. So there was a real mishmash of literature out there, and there was a need for a comprehensive mechanistic study to this effect.
Perfect. And did you have any expectations kind of coming into the study? Like, did you think that short intervals were going to help maximize the anabolic responses, or did you kind of feel any one way kind of heading into this?
Yeah, it's a good question. So in this study, we chose two quite different rest intervals, polar ends of the spectrum. So 1 minute, which would be considered very brief. Certainly to those who work out routinely will know that 60 seconds of rest in between fairly demanding sets of resistance exercise taken close to failure is pretty difficult over the course of an entire session. And at the other end of the spectrum, we had a 5-minute group. And again, those folks that work out routinely will know that's generally ample rest to take before you go back into another set. So our feeling going into this really was that these two quite divergent rest interval sessions would lead to different concentrations of hormones. So we thought that with our 1 minute interset rest, we'd get a spike in growth hormone and testosterone. But again, based on the idea, we don't think that response is particularly key to driving protein synthesis and cellular growth over time. We thought that the muscle protein synthesis response would be roughly equivalent between the two workouts.
Perfect. So I think that gives a good idea on what led you guys wanting to do this and what you were kind of expecting coming into it. So what did you guys kind of do to test this? What were kind of the methods of your study here?
Yeah, so as you mentioned previously, this was an acute investigation. So when you study muscle protein synthesis using stable isotope tracers and muscle biopsies, it tends to be an investigation that's performed over a number of hours. Certainly, more contemporary techniques using stable isotope tracers don't generally tend to go over days or weeks. We did this in an acute setting, so it's effectively a single day visit to our lab. So volunteers came to us first thing in the morning in the fasted state. We hooked them up to an IV infusion of that stable isotope tracer. And then after a period of time resting, we had them perform their workout. So they were randomized to 1 minute rest between their exercise sets or 5 minutes of rest. This was a combination of 2 leg resistance exercises from memory. And there were multiple sets of each exercise. I want to say it was 6 sets of each exercise. So it's generally quite a high volume session. And certainly those guys who were assigned to just take 1 minute rest in between each of those sets were feeling pretty nauseous by the time they got to the very end of the workout, really struggling to get back and do more work. And then in the period after exercise, we took some muscle biopsies, and what we were able to do was understand how much of our stable isotope tracer made its way into the muscle tissue that we obtained. And if you can understand that variable, you can calculate rates of muscle protein synthesis. And that's what we did. So we did that over 4 hours, this kind of acute, immediate, early phase of recovery after the session. And we also had these guys come back into the lab the following day, as we were interested to see how those protein synthesis rates would look 24 hours after the workout, because we know that changes in muscle protein turnover after a demanding bout of exercise can be sustained for quite a long time afterwards, and that the kind of net response over that whole recovery period seems to be really closely implicated in how muscle grows over time. It's probably important to point out that we did recruit only males to this study at the time. I think when we went through our ethical protocols, there was a concern that we might have to account for kind of menstrual cycle phase if we recruited female volunteers due to a possible influence on muscle protein turnover. In the years since, it's turned out that influence is not particularly strong, so we probably could have recruited females in, and we certainly, at this point, there's nothing to suggest we would expect anything different in females than males had we recruited them.
For any of the males that you recruited, did they have any background with resistance training, or were they pretty novice to resistance training, or what did that kind of training experience look like for them?
Yeah, good question. So these individuals were what we classified as resistance training experienced. So I think we'd said go into this that they needed at least a minimum of 6 months or perhaps even a year of prior resistance training before coming onto the study. Again, the reason we in the past have typically recruited from this population, it means that they're often able to respond to the high demands that we might place on them in the lab environment when we have them undergo a very demanding stimulus. So these tend to be people who are used to the sensation of working to quite a high level of fatigue and demand, and also in terms of form and generally understanding how to work through concentric and eccentric phases of a movement. These are people who require less instruction. And also there's some evidence that the more well-trained you become, that your muscle protein synthesis response to a given exercise bout might also change it as well.
Gotcha. And for these exercises that they did, do you remember what they were, or do you remember maybe even if they were just like compound or isolation movements? As I would say 60 seconds of rest on like a bicep curl, that doesn't feel crazy short to me. That feels like doable. But 60 seconds of rest on like a leg press or barbell back squat pretty close to failure sounds like torture to me. So do you remember what the kind of makeup of those exercises were? I think that you're looking for it right now.
Yeah, I'm trying to scan that. So I can tell you that these weren't compound movements. So all of this was machine based. Again, working through a relatively simple range of motion. leg press knee extension from memory. So we were deliberately targeting the quadriceps here. That's where we tend to take our muscle biopsy samples from that large quadricep muscle. So that's what we targeted. Let's say 6 sets of each of the exercises, again from memory, and each of those sets was pretty demanding. So we tailored it at 75% of their 1 rep max. Again, I guess aiming for that typical kind of 10 to 12 repetition before individuals started to fail and feel like they probably only had 1 or 2 more reps in the tank. So I guess that conventional hypertrophy zone that people typically would work to in the SSC literature is really where we try to guide these folks.
Perfect. So leg press, leg extension, 6 sets for each exercise, one group with 60 seconds rest between sets, the other group about 5 minutes of rest between sets, and taking these sets to failure. And the individuals were men that had resistance training experience. So I think that sets up kind of what you guys did. Now, what did you guys find here? What were the results of this study?
Some of the findings aligned with what we expected, and in some sense, some of the data didn't. So first of all, we were encouraged to see that our different training protocols and divergent rest intervals did lead to alterations in hormone concentrations. So in response to the workout with just 1 minute rest in between sets, we saw a higher testosterone response. So the growth hormone didn't differ between conditions, as the literature might suggest we might have seen, but the free testosterone and total testosterone response was greater with just 1 minute of interset rest. So we got that kind of a slightly higher spike and overall net exposure over that 4 hours of recovery to testosterone. So effectively, in the short rest interval condition, the working muscle was bathed in this higher hormonal environment, which some would suggest is greater for protein synthesis. However, when we calculated the rates of protein synthesis over that 4 hour early phase recovery period, we actually found that rates of synthesis were greater for the group that rested for 5 minutes in between sets, suggesting that there might have been some potential dampening effect in terms of muscle protein synthesis in the very short rest interval condition. So actually there are kind of quite conflicting findings in a sense. So we've got a higher hormonal response and actually a lower or a suppressed muscle protein synthetic response with the very short rest intervals.
And did you guys kind of speculate or hypothesize on why we might have saw that kind of divergence in this group that had kind of more testosterone levels? You'd think that would also increase these other kind of anabolic factors of muscle protein synthesis, stuff like that. So why do you think this divergence here kind of occurred?
Yeah, well, I guess the first point to make there is that the fact that we saw high testosterone, yet that had no association with muscle protein synthesis, did align with the work that had come out of the McMaster group over numerous years before. So in a sense, we were quite pleased to see that, but it gave us another problem in that we didn't expect it to be a dampening effect or a suppression. So we had to kind of think fast as to how we might explain that. So one of the best ways to try and put this is to think about if you undertake resistance training with very, very short rest intervals, this potentially causes a disturbance to cellular homeostasis. So there's a higher energy demand required in order to maintain the tension for repeated muscular contraction when you're not allowing enough rest. We know that muscle protein synthesis is an energy dependent process. So if you compromise cellular energy by not giving somebody sufficient rest, and you get this accumulation of metabolites, that could interfere with the process of muscle protein synthesis, and that may offer some explanation as to what we saw. I mean, when we looked at we saw higher lactate response with a very, very short rest interval condition as well. And actually, at the molecular level, when we looked at the signaling cues that govern muscle protein synthesis, we also saw a consistent pattern in that those signals seem to be dampened down in the very short rest interval conditions. So it actually supports the muscle protein synthesis data. So that's our working hypothesis. We don't think it's anything to do with the amount of work performed. So as you and your listeners can imagine, I'm sure when you train with a very, very short rest interval between sets, the amount of work that you're able to accrue over the entire session is going to be slightly lower. We kind of anticipated that might happen. I think it was somewhere between sort of around maybe 15-16% lower, the overall volume of the session, because these guys simply couldn't keep lifting the same number of reps at the same load over and over again. Whereas the 5-minute rest condition felt pretty fresh every time they got back on the machine. So they were able to kind of lift repeatedly, roughly the same amount every single set. However, what I would say is that even in the short rest interval condition, the total amount of work, the volume performed over the session was still sufficient based on the literature to more than maximize rates of muscle protein synthesis. So we, even set some reps way before we probably hit the threshold ceiling to maximize that muscle protein synthesis response. So even though the work was a little bit lower, we think that was quite negligible in terms of muscle anabolism.
Interesting. Yeah, I would say that one thing that you commonly hear is that one reason you don't want to have short rest intervals is because it's going to cap the amount of volume that you can do. It's going to reduce the number of kind of reps or load that you can do. And with kind of total volume seemingly being a large driver of hypertrophy, people suggest resting long enough to where that doesn't occur. But it sounds like in this particular study, and I totally agree with you, like if they were doing 12 sets for kind of their quads there, even if they did, 20% less volume, let's say the equivalent of 8 sets for their quads or somewhere in there, I would still expect pretty maximal hypertrophy in that single session for that. So I think that's actually a really good point. And kind of like when I was reading through this, I was like, okay, they did end up doing less volume. I'm sure that's a reason why they might have saw this kind of blunted muscle protein synthesis across this time period, but it sounds like that's really not a huge factor here.
Yeah, we don't think it's a huge factor, and one of the interesting things is talking about this work over the years since its publication. I've had conversations with guys, girls who typically kind of the elite end of resistance training, even competitor bodybuilding, who train with a very short rest interval. Kind of talk to me about, well, yeah, this clearly isn't the case for me, and these are very elite individuals with who've trained in a way that they've accumulated really, really large muscle mass. And I always say that they've spoken to me about, well, that it doesn't lower the volume that I can complete, but the key there is that these are individuals who've been doing this firstly for a very long time, probably routinely, and secondly, in any given session or any given week, in terms of training frequency and volume, they're hitting, the desired muscle group, that they're giving it more than enough volume and frequency in a given week to maximize, I would say, growth responses. So sure, you can shorten that rest interval, but I think as long as you're going over a certain number of sets and volume, and you've been doing this a long time, I wouldn't suggest that very short rest intervals would be harmful for those more elite individuals. I wouldn't think, just purely because of the frequency and volume that they, as I say, that they accrue over any given week of training. Perhaps a mere mortal like me, maybe you as well, Ryan. I don't know, mere mortals like us, who maybe you can train that muscle group, once, twice a week, and maybe you train it alongside other muscle groups in any given session. Then sure, maybe very short rest interval might compromise volume in such a way that it does inhibit our long-term gains. Maybe.
Yeah, I think as always, it depends on the context of your entire program. Like if you're already doing like the study had, doing 12 sets for a particular muscle in a particular session, if you shorten your rest periods to get that volume in, and then maybe you're doing a little bit less volume, well, you're probably still doing enough volume to maximize hypertrophy in that single session. So there's this kind of interplay between rest periods and volume and frequency that all need to be kind of considered when trying to maximize hypertrophy here. So a good place to go here is before we go there, is there anything else with the results that you wanted to mention, or is kind of the key finding here that testosterone levels were a bit higher in the shorter rest period group, but muscle protein synthesis was actually a bit higher in the group that rested a little bit longer? Is there anything else you wanted to mention regarding the results?
No, I think that's the key take home really. And maybe one surprising finding that I touched on before, but it may be worth reiterating, is that the fact that the very short rest interval didn't lead to superior levels of growth hormone in that recovery phase afterwards. Again, the literature had led us to think that would be the case, but yet that wasn't. So even in terms of the divergence in hormonal responses to very short versus very long rest intervals, it wasn't as stark as we might have expected based on the previous literatures. So I think even in individuals kind of manipulating this particular variable with the idea that they might get those hormonal spikes, it's probably not going to be as drastic as you think it is anyway.
Mm-hmm. And I think that this study was probably one of the studies that helped people kind of gain the understanding of, you don't necessarily want to have your training sessions revolve around the idea of increasing these hormones acutely, as it doesn't seem as though these acute increases in testosterone or different things like that really might impact long-term hypertrophy all that much. So I think that's a good kind of key takeaway. And based on that, has there been, or have you been kind of paying attention to literature on rest intervals and stuff like that since then? Has there been any kind of divergent literature or literature that kind of agrees with this, or have you been kind of paying attention to maybe some of the more recent literature since this has been published?
Yeah, so we always keep our eye on the literature as it evolves, and we receive alerts that kind of speak to this kind of work and new publications emerging in the area. What I would say is that there are, perhaps no more detailed mechanistic studies than this have emerged, to the best of my knowledge, but individuals have tried to kind of take this framework and roll it out in the longer term and perform training studies. I guess training studies with a larger sample size than previous, to try and see whether these acute findings that we've detected in this mechanistic study actually translate in the longer term. And I think Dr. Brad Schoenfeld has been involved in and perhaps he, I think, led a couple of really nice studies on this area that, again, have supported or reinforced the message that very short rest interval could potentially be harmful for some of the adaptive responses to resistance training over the longer term. I want to say that Brad was at the helm of a study that compared 1 minute versus 3 minutes of rest over the longer term on muscle thickness and strength changes. And again, there was taken all data points together, there was an idea that the data actually seemed to favor the group that rested for 3 minutes over the course of the study as compared to the 1 minute group. Again, I think that study was undertaken in recreationally trained, so people with some training experience, but mere mortals, and not the very elite. So I think it's worth taking that context there as well.
So I think that provides a good overview of what you guys did, any kind of literature that agrees with you, which it does sound like there is, or has been some more recent literature that kind of agrees that, hey, if you're looking to maximize muscle hypertrophy, you probably don't want too short of rest periods there, although it still depends on the context of your program, how much total volume you're already doing, and even I could imagine if you were keeping, 3 to 4 reps in reserve and not training to all-out failure, and you were on your isolation lifts, that 60 seconds might be perfectly fine for that individual as, 3 reps in reserve on a bicep curl. I'd probably be ready to go after just a minute of rest. So
yeah, I buy that.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of other things to kind of consider, but I would say for maybe some of those bigger lifts like leg press and compounds, maybe don't shorten those rest periods too much. So I think that kind of as a final round out here, are there any kind of practical takeaways that you think that someone can gain from this research that you're doing here on rest intervals and maybe applying it to their own programs, or if they're coaching other people, even applying it to that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you summed it up really nicely there, Ryan. All I would say is that, the study was designed, as I outlined at the start, really to try and further disentangle this relationship between acute hormone responses and the processes that control muscle growth over time, which we think is primarily muscle protein synthesis, and we achieve that. What happened afterwards was that in some quarters there was a kind of misinterpretation of the literature that of this study, that we tried to define the optimal rest period required to which we hadn't, and we certainly weren't saying that 5 minutes was what everybody needed, and 1 minute would be harmful for everybody. That was really not what we were trying to do. And similarly, some people thought, well, we'll strike the sweet spot. We'll go for 2.5 minutes, 3 minutes, and that's all good. I think you summed it up really nicely, though. I think people want to really take a look at if muscle hypertrophy is the primary goal, packing on as much lean tissue mass as possible in a given time frame. That could be for competition, or could be in the off season, prior to competition again. Then you want to think about how many times you're able to train a muscle group in a given week, and make sure you're kind of hitting those guidelines around frequency. That 2 seems to be enough, but if you can go to three sessions on a given muscle group a week, certainly if you're very elite, then that's probably where you want to go. And that the amount of volume that you hit that muscle group within a given session is sufficient in terms of sets and reps and the degree of effort that you elicit in each of those sets, as long as you don't need to go to the point of failure such that that you can barely move and you're kind of compromising form and risking injury. But I think if you get what we've always referred to as close to the point of close to the point of fatigue, where you don't feel you could do much more, and you're doing that several times in a given exercise, and then you're doing several exercises for a muscle group, you're probably doing everything you need to. But those primary considerations really are training volume, frequency. We don't think that people really need to pay an awful lot of attention to things like rest interval or even the load. Others have shown over the years that the load that you train with as well doesn't seem to be a really, really important driver for muscle hypertrophy over time anyway. But again, I think it's prudent if you've got time in your workouts not to go too short with the rest intervals would be my advice. So most people generally will kind of check their phone out or have a brief conversation with someone in between sets and then get back to it. 2-3 minutes is probably where I think works universally for most people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would say my practical experience coaching clients very much so kind of agrees with that summary there. Like, it seems as though the drivers of getting actual results is someone's consistency with their nutrition and training. But once that's in place, then for the training aspect, making sure they're training with sufficient volume, with at least a couple times per muscle per week frequency, and making sure they have consistent effort. So training within a few reps from that point of fatigue or that point of failure, but not necessarily grinding reps and going beyond that point. And when it comes to rest periods, kind of do your sets when you feel kind of ready to do that. Like, you don't need to get crazy precise with it and be like, at the 62-second mark, I'm going to start the set no matter what. I think that there's some leeway there in which maybe for the less fatiguing the exercise and maybe the more kind of isolation-y the exercise, the lower on that rest kind of spectrum that you can be, where I think even downwards of 60 seconds to 120 seconds, that 1 to 2 minutes for those exercises is probably fine. And then for maybe more fatiguing exercises that use more muscle groups, more kind of compound exercises, I would kind of err on the side of about 2 to 4 minutes for those for the most part. Does that sound pretty fair?
I agree. I think, even in my own practice, I can definitely say to you that anything involving arms is, generally get the volume in as quickly as possible, get through those sets and minimize rest. Is the way to go. Anything involving legs, generally, I tend to need a little bit more rest in between before I feel like I can go on and put a good set in again. So no, that totally aligns with my thinking. And I would say that, to urge people to, take the study for what it is. It's an investigation of muscle protein synthesis that we think plays an important role, or is qualitatively predictive over time of how much muscle somebody might build. What it doesn't equate to here is change in strength. So again, if you're working, if your primary goal in training is strength accretion, when you're working with extremely high relative loads and low reps, then rest interval is a completely different beast. It's extremely long rest intervals because you're effectively practicing close to the point of a maximum lift every time in order to optimize performance. So I totally buy in that context that rest interval is probably important to adaptive strength gains over time.
Yep, absolutely. And I like that you touched on strength there for a second, as my audience is definitely focused a bit more on physique development and stuff like that. But I'm sure some of them play around with some strength training as well. So yeah, if you're strength training, you definitely want to minimize the fatigue between sets to keep that kind of bar velocity high, and train with a little bit longer rest periods definitely makes sense in that context. So I think with that, Dr. Breen, if people want to stay up to date on the research that you're doing, is there anywhere that they can go to kind of follow you, whether you have a new publication or something like that they can kind of be aware of?
Yeah, it's just, I think if you punch my name into the Google Scholar, you can sign up to alerts. So generally any new, alerts to any authors, professors that you're interested in kind of keeping up with their work as it emerges. You can get email alerts when those folks publish. But generally, Twitter is a good space to connect with me and hear about what it is we're doing. So at Leigh Breen, there aren't too many folks out there with my name, so I'm quite easy to find on Twitter. So that's the best place to tune in.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for coming on today. I really enjoyed it.
Pleasure, Ryan. Thanks for your time.